America in the 1970s. The idealism of the 1960s were beaten away by war and lost idealism. On the charts, David Bowie, Queen, and the Doobie Brothers were shattering expectations, while the discos filled with bright-eyed young minds looking to just devolve into decadence.
Young Americans.
The Watergate scandal shattered our confidence in our country. It was a time of transformation, a time of change, a time of sensual pleasure. Meanwhile, in Wisconsin, a bunch of nerds were playing with little soldier men. And those fucking nerds would transform culture as we know it.
I mean, to be fair, you can't not be a nerd with the last name Gygax, all right? Hi, my name's Gary Gygax, and I would like to take you on 4 dates, 3 of which will be at the library.
Let me tell you about my complicated relationship with Jehovah's Witness. This is Wizard and the Bruiser.
Yeah.
I am the Wizard, Jake Young.
And I am the Bruiser, Holden McNeely, so don't cross me or you'll get a beat down.
This episode, we're talking about Dungeons and Dragons.
Dungeons and Dragons, Jake.
I'm actually in the middle of a game right now. I'm playing with Brian Miller over at College Humor, who's an amazing dungeon master, or game master, as we call them now.
Oh.
And it's honestly, and it got a big uptick in Stranger Things. It's becoming part of the culture.
I think it's really resurging. I'm getting a lot of people saying, hey, you know what? I think I would like to play a game of Dungeons and Dragons, which is like the craziest shit to me. I think Stranger Things definitely helped that with the Gorgon. Mm-hmm. What was I going to say? I was going to say I have to, full disclosure to the audience, okay? Mm-hmm. I personally have never played a formal game of Dungeons and Dragons.
But here's the thing, though. You're an improviser. You're a storyteller. You're a writer. Like, deep down, you would take to it like flies on enjoyable shit.
My lady and I have actually been talking about trying to get a game together. And I will say, I tried to look it up today. I played for one afternoon with a lot of members of Murder Fist, actually. I played a version of that that was like a superhero game. I can't remember what it was called. I think it started with an E, but I can't remember. But yeah, so I got the sense of it, and I have to say, we all did it fully in character the entire time. Like, we committed 100%, and I may never have laughed as hard as that afternoon playing that game.
It's a genuinely fun and very intimate almost experience. There's highs and lows. You plan, you train, but then there's also huge amounts of chance involved. Mm-hmm. It is a very fun experience. It's very spontaneous and rewarding. And it all started. It's all like you can draw a straight line from chess.
Yeah.
To these what were called miniature games, war games.
War games. I will mention, in 1935, there was a copyright in a little game called Jury Box, and that was one of the first known instances of a formal game where people pretended to reenact different characters, right? Mm-hmm. So it was a game where there was like these different court cases, and the people, you'd get a group of people together, and some people would be the lawyers, some people would be the judge, some people would be the jury, and they would reenact these games. So there was some of that going on, but yes, chess definitely in a huge way. And then
Little Wars by H.G. Wells.
Yes, yeah, Little Wars by H.G. Wells. Do you know anything much about that one?
It was so for one of the oldest kinds of toys are toy soldiers. Little Green Army men is how we knew them. Tin soldiers, lead soldiers, just little cute army dudes holding weapons in various infantries and various arrangements. And Little Wars was a book published by H.G. Wells. Which had like a really weird title, which was I'm sorry, I don't have my notes on me, but it was something like "Wonderful Little Games for Boys of War and also Intelligent Girls That Like Boy Things." Marcus, if you can look that up.
And also intelligent boys that kind of feel like girls sometimes, and they sort of identify in that in certain periods.
Little Wars, a game for boys from 12 years of age to 150, and for that more intelligent sort of girl who likes boys' games and books.
But what about me? Is the game for old Mr. Bad Touch? Old Mr. Bad Touch wants to play with the mini boys and the mini girls.
Is he above 12 and below 150?
Ooh, maybe.
Super producer Marcus Sparks bringing that old school squirminess.
And so it's kind of a combination, right? Of and a lot of these games too is Little Wars. So much of it came from historical reenactment of wars and how battles, specifically battles, and how battles, and also saying what if we change the way this historical battle went. And I would also like to bring up there was the advent of societies that reenacted battles. War reenactors. In 1968, you had the groups like the Sealed Knot Society founded for charity to reenact English Civil War battles.
Now, you grew up in North Carolina, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, sir, I did.
Did you know people that reenacted Civil War shit? Because I have never known anyone that was like, time for a jaunty day of dying in a field.
Yes, I did actually. I took a Civil War class in my high school, taught by 3 of the teachers because they just loved talking about the Civil War so much. And my family was really into, like, if you go to my house, there's like a wall of Civil War books. And like when that special came out, the Ken Burns series, we like gathered around and watched the whole thing. And in the Civil War class, one of the teachers, I believe he also taught like math or something, he one day showed up in his garb. In his full, like, I think it was Confederate garb, and he had the full thing and the whole, like, all right, you know what?
Ain't no Yankee gonna be teaching in that high school.
It's a piece of history, okay? He's just reenacting the history.
I know it's a piece of history. It just irks me how he was like, well, it's North Carolina. Maybe he was a Union soldier. Just don't try to.
Well, somebody's got to be the Union. Somebody's got to be somebody. I'm sure they had to pay some poor sap to be the Union. So, anyways, I think. But he showed up in his full garb, and that was a thing he did. He went out to parks and and honestly, I would totally do that myself. Yeah, I would totally do that. But I'd be getting hammered. I'd be sneaking away and hiding out in the tent. I'd be trying to figure out how to get out of the battles and stuff, like as my character.
Walking around with like your arms stuffed in your shirt, being like, oi, they already got me, they did. Oh, me.
Why are you talking with a British accent?
It's all timey time talk.
Oh, my got my penis all blue. Was sat on it too long.
So this very wonky world of military reenactments and small soldiers and battles, you can draw a line from there to modern games like Risk and Gettysburg, which is like for kids that were like a little too good for Risk.
So I think Gettysburg's actually a really cool kind of knot that I tied between our founders, which would be Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, created Dungeons and Dragons. Their childhood favorite games, both of their childhood favorite games were Gettysburg, which made me really want to fucking check out Gettysburg, the game. I love the book, by the way, and that whole battle is fascinating.
I'm more of a fan of the address.
Yeah, that's a good address. That's a good address.
I mean, if you got to go like top 3 addresses.
And also, they derived the rule system from a game called Chainmail.
That was made by Gary Gygax and another person. So this is
Jeff Perrin, I believe. Yes.
So this is where we get to the early 70s, late 60s. People talk about scenes, like a certain time and place, like London in the when punk was starting, or like Seattle during the grunge era. These like insular small communities that were like kind of working together and collaborating and sharing ideas and like kind of exploding this new form of doing things, and like having one breakout finally like expose it to the world,
because they were racing to get this game out, because other people were working on the same type of game.
So this is what happened is in Lake Geneva, there's this society of military reenacting and strategy gamers who were really into Napoleonic War military tiny soldier push. Yeah, they were all about Napoleonic era battles. They had the miniatures and big elaborate set pieces, and one member, a guy by the name of Dave Wesley, couldn't really loved these games and couldn't really get, he was like a little bit farther away. He was like planning to go into the military. So he had time to think things out. And so he blew everyone's mind when he said, today we're playing a new game called Braunstein, and it takes place in a German town during the Napoleonic era. And here's the thing, you're not commanding armies, you're all individual characters.
Ah.
You're the local pastor. You're the mayor. You're a visiting French army general. You're a visiting German spy. And then he got people to play and reenact the roles while trying to pursue their individual goals. And this set off a bomb. The idea that you could even do that with like persistent characters and you know that you were embodying a spirit and interacting with other people. You were collaborating. You were trying to like push your own goals, and like you would meet after hours to try and figure out what the next step would be in the strategy. So Dave Arneson immediately is like loving this. He takes that new idea and he introduces he introduces those ideas into his own basement game that he'd been running called Blackmore.
Yes, Blackmore, which is this fictional sort of medieval world that he had created, and he incorporated into that.
And now Dave Arneson wasn't as like driven. He wasn't as like he wasn't into publishing. He wasn't as into rules. So he would like take some aspects from Braunstein for the combat. He originally used rock, paper, scissors. And so he kind of just gave up on that and started using rules from Chainmail.
Yes, and implemented certain things such as adventuring in dungeons, and I think the most important thing, which is using a neutral judge, which would later be termed a dungeon master, and that was
also persistent characters that grew in between each adventure, which was also like the very idea of leveling up was born there, and that's something that we carry to video games to this day.
And so let's talk about how Gygax and Arneson came to meet each other. So Gygax, I think with some others, he created Gen Con, and I think we should talk about Gen Con a little bit here.
Lake Geneva, Gen.
Ah, gotcha. The Geneva Convention. Of course. It all makes sense now. Yeah. So he created this yearly convention for gaming folk. Lord knows that must have been one of the first gaming conventions ever, right? I mean, I know conventions, I think Gen Con could be an episode. I feel like a lot of the things we're going to talk about in this episode could have their own episode. Gen Con being one of them, and definitely I want to cover conventions as a whole at some point and the history of conventions. Was this one of the first, it must have been one of the first gaming conventions in America.
I mean, by its very nature, these huge military miniatures games needed a big crowd of people and needed collaboration and needed a lot of like face-to-face time, especially in a pre-internet day. So it's definitely one of the bigger, more influential ones. I don't have my notes on me. It could very well be one of the earliest, but
I do know that it started with like 20 dudes in a basement, which is fucking crazy because it later became the hugest convention. It was thousands of people meeting up. They had to move it to bigger. It was kind of like Comic-Con. It got bigger than it ever thought it could possibly become.
But Gygax was like he was a founder of the convention. He he published individual games. He created Chainmail. Like Arneson was a fan of his. He admired him, and so he was like, "Hey, you got to come over see this cool shit I'm doing."
Yes.
And Gygax sat in with for a couple of sessions of Blackmore and was like, "There's something here."
Totally blown away by it, right?
So the two began to collaborate to try and like codify what exactly this is.
What's funny is actually when I was reading, and this is just kind of off my memory, but I believe that he and a friend were meeting with Gygax for a totally different game, and they were like, "Well, let's play this other game that I've been hearing about, this Blackmore thing," and then just like whatever with that other game, he was like all in on this sort of a version of Blackmore.
Now here's where there's kind of a divergence, because like people compare these two guys to like Lennon and McCartney, to Steve Jobs and Wozniak. Like it takes two kinds of energies to make something this big. And this,
first of all, these guys were getting way more pussy than all this. All right, let's just nail that down right here. All right, Gygax, they called him King of the Boner Men. All right,
it's Woz versus Gax. Which one you got?
I would love to see that boxing match.
I mean, King of the Bonerman. That was the game between Blackmore.
That was the game between Blackmore and Dungeons
and
Dragons to see. Yeah, exactly. It was like so racy they couldn't even. It was banned in Japan.
Now this is a very close knit community of gamers. So like that Braunstein bomb had influenced a lot of people. So Gygax knew that if they were going to make this thing out into the public and make it hit, they had to work fast. And he knows that from personal experience because he published games before. He knew exactly how competitive the publishing world is. He had a family. He was working a part-time job in his basement, I think cobbling shoes. He was like he was serious about this. Meanwhile, Arneson hung out around it. Blackmore was played literally on a ping pong table in his basement, and he was sitting on a big couch at the head of the table being like, nah man, that demon's got a phaser. It was two very different outlooks on what gaming is about. And so they spent a year rapidly playtesting. Arneson working on the Blackmore campaign with a bunch of cool teenagers smoking pot, a bunch of grown-ups, while Gygax was playtesting with literally his kids.
Called Greyhawk?
The Greyhawk campaign. Both were introduced later as modules.
Yeah, which was some of the first modules, which are essentially adventures, which or campaigns in D&D.
And playtesting is something we take for granted these days, but it was actually, it's one of those weird X factors that made Dungeons and Dragons better than its competition.
Because they just playtested the hell out of it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, they playtested the hell out of it, and
we should maybe say playtesting, if obviously is sort of the testing ground before you put a game out, where you sort of play it over and over again and make little changes and corrections to the game before you put it out. And the playtesting phase is very, it needs to be very thorough and well thought out and specific.
Now, original Dungeons and Dragons was a little bit finickier than the current iteration. Now it's a very smooth. The 5th edition they just came out.
Yes, they just came out with the 5th edition.
It's almost built for watching on YouTube because it's so conversational and flows so much more easily than previous editions. It's incredibly fun to play, especially if your goal isn't to min-max strategize your half-orc thief. It's a terrible match of race and class, whatever. But you have no decks. What are you even doing?
Terrible. You gotta be a mage dog. If you really want to do a dog casting spells, no one expects the dog to cast a spell. You'll roll 40 over 80 on that one.
In playtesting, the dungeon master wasn't even sitting at the same table. There was literally a caller on the player's table that would shout out each individual player's actions, speaking for the group. And on the other side of the room, the dungeon master would be yelling what happens on the other side.
That sounds fun, though. I like any game that involves mass amounts of screaming. I'm in, but that's just me.
Now, they knew from playtesting that they had a hit. They knew from being in the scene that there were so many assholes that were this close to coming out with their own versions, and they knew that they were ready to publish, but there was a problem. They were broke as shit.
Broke as fuck, and they could not get a publisher to go with it. They wanted to, I forget the name of the publisher, but the publisher for Gettysburg, they actually were trying to get them to go with it. They wouldn't do it, and then enter a man named Brian Bloom and the Bloom family. Brian Bloom, he provided the funding to publish the original Dungeons and Dragons.
$1,000.
With a run of 1,000 units. Too.
Okay.
And it got it out there in 1974.
Hand-packed 3 booklets in a little wooden box.
That's it, and it sold out within a year. And then within that year, they put out a thing with additional rules, and a sample dungeon from Arneson's original campaign were released in 1975 in the Blackmore supplement, and that would be the first pre-made module or adventure in the Dungeons and Dragons whole universe. And I guess to explain that, you can make up your own as a dungeon master. You can make up your own adventure, right? That all you need is the core set, which is the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Player's Handbook, and the Monster Manual, right? You need those 3 things core to play games of Dungeons & Dragons. But if you sort of don't want to create your own story and world, you can just kind of get these preset stories, and they're called modules or adventures. Adventures make up a campaign. So a campaign is if you were going to sit down over many weeks. An adventure would be like one sitting, right, Jake? Right.
So this is kind of interesting. This is kind of the lifeblood of the whole role-playing game industry is the idea that, how do you build an empire if you just have to sell 3 pamphlets, and even then, it's easy to just, pass along how the rules work. You put out these adventure modules, you put out new classes, you adjust the rules. They published a magazine that would adjust and, figure out the edge cases. This was a living, evolving game that you had to actively follow if you wanted to play correctly. And Now, here's the deal. The Bloom family,
Yes.
Gygax and Arneson and a few other people started TSR.
Yes,
Which
Tactical Studies Rules Incorporated, the company under which they made D&D in late 1976. This happened. No, I'm sorry. I think that happened before then. Arneson left TSR.
Maybe because he was barely employable.
Yeah. He said it was to become an independent game designer, and I think he went off and kind of made some other games and stuff. But yes, you were going to say about TSR? I mean, there's a lot to say about TSR.
So this is where the drama happens, is the tension. Here's where the tension happens. We've talked about this before. There's always, I don't know if whether you've watched The Social Network or
Absolutely
the Jobs movie.
Lay it on me. I've seen it all.
Or any other, just any time a bunch of nerds are goofing around and then whoopsie doodle, they have $1 million idea, the knives are out.
That's right. Well, I mean, we're talking about when after Arneson left, there was a lot of legal trouble.
Arneson sued Gygax 5 individual times to maintain royalty rights and to have his name as the co-creator.
Well, to be fair, he did co-create it, and then right after he left, they were like, no, it's not Dungeons & Dragons anymore. It's Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. So they released a new player's manual, called it Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, said, no, this is different from what you did, Arneson, and so you can't have any more money off of this property.
The words they kept using in those lawsuits were separate product. There was the basic set of Dungeons & Dragons, which came out. For a little bit there were 2 different versions. The basic set, which was Dungeons & Dragons, created by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, and then there was Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which was a separate product. When you have a separate product that's literally called better version of existing product, they're completely different.
Super Mario Brothers.
Yeah, exactly.
Now we're getting into so this thing's blowing up. It's a huge in gaming circles. It's one of the more dominant new properties within that very niche audience.
Time to go to Hollywood, baby.
But wait a minute, where's all that buzz coming from? Why are people? It's a fun game, but why would people give a shit about Dungeons and Dragons enough to sell the rights to books and movies and cartoons? What would give it a bunch of publicity? The Satanic Panic!
I was about to say, Satan, the devil.
Because, even back in the day, these are a bunch of nerds in the middle of nowhere just making a game for themselves. Those original pamphlets are full of just big titty harpies and barbarians
and devil-looking creatures and
demons
stuff.
And shit.
Yeah.
A bunch of monsters from J.R.R. Tolkien with a single letter changed. Oh, it's not a Balrog, it's a Baelor.
So the nation freaked out about Satan and Dungeons and Dragons, which they also did for Magic. If you remember that comes later. In the 90s, everyone freaked out about satanic imagery in the card game.
It all began in 1979 with an unfortunate soul with the unfortunate name of James Dallas Egbert III.
Egbert and Gygax, man. You get those 2 dudes to the strip club, it's all falling apart, man.
Jimmy Egbert.
Poor Mr. Egbert was a 16-year-old college student, which is very young for college. He was always an awkward boy, and he found himself overwhelmed with his new surroundings and fell into a mental episode of some kind. And he wandered into the underground steam tunnels of his university and disappeared. Many believed suicide. In fact, it was later revealed that he just kind of ran away and took on various jobs across the country and hid at various friends' houses. But a private detective, whose last name was Deere, told press after coming up with nothing that, I don't know, he played a game where he was in a maze with a bunch of demons, must have lost sight of who he was, had a huge ego meltdown, and wandered the pipes like it was one of his dungeons.
So people are blaming games for fucking the tragic shit with kids all the way back then with Dungeons and Dragons. It's crazy before there was even actual imagery.
That story became the novel Mazes and Monsters, which was a big Go Ask Alice cautionary tale of a bright-eyed young boy whose mind was warped by these imageries and role playings. And the only reason any of you know what Mazes and Monsters is because it was turned into a hilarious bad TV movie starring Tom Hanks.
Dude.
You literally can Google Tom Hanks Mazes and Monsters. It ends with him having a freak out in the steam tunnels, and he's hallucinating with a bunch of like bad, shitty 80s era, 70s, 80s era monsters going like burger, burger, burger. And it ends with him in a mental, it ends with him living at his parents' house, still believing he is part of the game.
Oh my God, no. He's like seeing monsters and stuff. That's
there were also other unfortunate incidents where teenagers were having emotional problems, and because the game started with various game clubs, started adopting the game in various colleges across the universities. In 1985, there was a segment on 60 Minutes hosted by Ed Bradley, who was at the time one of the most prominent journalists, very prominent journalist. This is 60 Minutes, one of the biggest news shows ever.
Absolutely.
And he presented Gary Gygax and his press guy from TSR with these photos of teenagers that killed themselves, and being like, he was found with Dungeons and Dragons in his apartment. He was found with Dungeons and Dragons in his room. Like, what do you want to do? And Gary Gygax, being the cool nerd that he is, was like, well, I mean, we're in the middle of a teen suicide epidemic. Like, you pointed at like 6 dead teenagers. That's barely a statistic.
And this is the most popular game.
Yeah, no, the teenagers kill themselves who play sports. Teenagers kill themselves that are in marching band. Like, you can't lay this at our feet. But that wasn't enough, because then they would transfer to Patricia Polling. Patricia Polling, a concerned mother that started BAD, which was a acronym kind of like MAD, so it was like Bothered Against Dungeons and Dragons. Hold on, let me double check what that acronym
stands for. Oh my God, man, this is amazing. Thank you for bringing this in.
You can watch this on YouTube right now, and I'm not going to say
It is bothered about Dungeons and Dragons.
Bothered about Dungeons and Dragons. I'm not okay. I don't want to speak ill of the dead. This family went through a tragedy, but they show a picture of Patricia's son, and he was the gayest teenager I've ever seen in my entire life.
Well, if we're speaking ill about the dead right now, George Washington, go fuck yourself.
So all this news, all this coverage, all these things, this is going to warp your mind. There's demons and titties in it. Oh, this is the worst. And that was And while this was happening, while all this bad publicity was happening, the TSR got a distribution deal with Random House Publishing. So while all this danger news was happening, Dungeons and Dragons was showing up in every bookstore in America.
Oh, okay. Wait, you in around what time is that? Around what?
This was in the 80s.
Yeah,
okay.
83, 84.
Because because at the same time, one of my favorite things, Mr. Gygax Goes to Hollywood, which should be its own little spin-off TV show. So TSR breaks off into 4 different ventures. TSR Inc., which is like the core, which is like your player's handbook, TSR International, TSR Ventures, and TSR Entertainment. And TSR Entertainment was Gygax literally going to Hollywood to try to hawk D&D properties to showbiz. And what he managed to do, he only got one thing sold, but that one thing was the Dungeons and Dragons TV series, animated TV series that ran from 83 to 85, 27 episodes total. It was actually #1 in its time slot for 2 years. The story of it is, I really want to go back and watch it. Apparently, it's not bad. 6 friends.
It's pretty bad.
It's pretty terrible. 6 friends transported into a fantasy realm via a magic roller coaster.
The character designs are like real janky. It's real bad. But okay, so TSR is this company founded by gamers, founded from this very experimental spirit, literally borrowing stuff from everything from Conan the Barbarian to Lord of the Rings. And it was
Dark Shadows was a big influence as well, apparently.
It was this single media entity that was very organic, but now it was worth money. And so as the first company big enough to afford lawyers, TSR was suing the shit out of people. Did you make your own module for D&D? Fuck you, you're getting sued. Are you making a game that's kind of like D&D? Fuck you, you're getting sued.
They were just total dicks about it.
That was the thing. There was this adversarial relationship that had begun to foment, and people began to resent them. While Gary was in Hollywood, living like a fucking cocaine king, by the way, the Bloom brothers were in charge of the business.
Yes.
And they fucked the goose.
They fucked it up.
TSR was in debt for millions of dollars.
$30 million, Jake. That's a lot of millions of dollars.
And using some of his Hollywood contacts, Gary begged for help from a woman named Lorraine Williams.
Lorraine Williams.
Who ended up becoming part of the board, who then bought out the Bloom Brothers shares, who then kicked Gary out.
Yep.
And for several years, Lorraine became this like evil woman, this weird focal point. I remember Reddit had some weird shit with their CEO was like a girl and therefore represented everything wrong with the corruption of our once pure culture. And so Lorraine became the villain of every like pure-blooded D&D fan.
When I was reading up on her, it said she felt superior to gamers.
Yeah, it was all this thing. She represented like all the corporate sellout of Dungeons and Dragons, man.
But actually, she revitalized the company for many, many years before it did eventually fall. For a lot of years, she actually, but it just seems like they got greedy later on. They tried to compete with Magic the Gathering by coming out with their own.
Are you talking about
Dragon Dice? Dragon Dice, a version of a collectible card game, but with dice, which is a really bad idea.
Terrible idea.
Because first of all, like I think a lot of what people are collecting is the artwork and stuff like that. But instead, you're just sort of like chiseling stuff into dice. It's also incredibly expensive to make, and it started to do well on the onset. So they immediately rushed out a bunch of expansions and just went crazy and just spent and cost so much money to make.
The novels were doing well, so what did they do? They published 12 novels at once. Like it was just not a good business.
Oversaturated. Just
they would release new editions that many believed were greedy money grabs. Like it's either I think it's 3rd edition or 4th edition where it was more reliant on buying miniatures and play sets in order to squeeze more money out of fans.
It was just so obvious. They just got so greedy, and they didn't need to because they had really revitalized the whole company and kept it going. So I believe, where is it? It is
competitors started arriving. Pathfinder, which is a game that's based on, I think, Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, or I think so. I think that's right. Began outselling Dungeons & Dragons and was deemed a more player-friendly company.
Yes.
Vampire the Masquerade. You played Vampire the Masquerade.
I did have a weird, we kind of played Vampire the Masquerade with my
did you just
church
give hand
group.
Jobs in a cemetery?
I think we just acted we talked like assholes for an hour, and then our church leader came into the room and was like, I'm appalled at everything you people have been saying for the last hour.
And then you tried to mind control him into being gay.
Exactly. He did,
which is a thing you can do in Vampire the Masquerade.
Yeah, he did start fucking us, so I guess it worked. So in 1997, they're $30 million in debt. Lorraine Williams sells her company to their competitors themselves, the people they were trying to compete with Dragon Dice, Wizards of the Coast. Wizards of the Coast out in Seattle, a company formed in 1990, gained popularity with Magic the Gathering. Wizards of the Coast is balling right now. They got Dungeons & Dragons, Magic the Gathering, and the Pokemon trading game. Fucking how insane the money they must be raking in on the constant. It's to this day it's owned by Wizards of the Coast, like we said. It's the 5th edition.
Double check, Marcus. I'm sorry. I think Wizards of the Coast got bought out by Hasbro.
By Hasbro, yes, they did get bought out by Hasbro in 1999 for $325 million.
So, with that new investment and with an understanding that this entire game has been the subject of controversies and jerked around, and its fans have been used and abused left and right, they finally play tested and came out with 5th edition, which has been fairly popular, and I'm playing it right now, and it's genuinely a really good game. You don't need you don't need any miniatures. You just kind of need the 3 core books, the players, a
20-sided die, because they implemented the D20 system in the 3rd edition, which they've kind of gone with since then, but that kind of simplified the game in a lot of ways.
Oh yeah, original D&D and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. It was the way I interviewed my dungeon master. I just kissed his ring and begged for console, and he said that original D&D and Advanced, basically each class was playing their own weird mini game, and it was impossible to keep track of everything. And the D20 system basically rolled down to I want to do the thing. All right. Do you have the ability to do the thing? Yes. What's your modifier? I'm +3 better at doing this thing than if I didn't know how to do it. And
Yep. And that's it. The modifiers are based on 6 abilities that everyone has a certain amount of level in: strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Also, I would like to say, I know we have to wrap things up soon, but I thought it was really cool that Gygax actually invented the alignment system, the lawful good, neutral evil, chaotic evil, that sort of grid that you see a lot of people kind of using like different things from fiction and kind of like implementing those characters into that. He actually created that, and I think that's really brilliant. And you have to pick your alignment when you go into the game, and that really kind of defines a lot of what your choices are in a more story sense.
It helps the role playing, because in a good game of Dungeons and Dragons isn't about trying to win. It's about trying to win within your character's truth.
Yes.
This is, I think, to wrap this up, I got to ask, Holden, what is your alignment?
My alignment would probably be
Chaotic dickhole?
Yeah, chaotic shithead, which I think is like way off to the side. It's definitely chaotic. It's probably chaotic neutral, because I like good and I like bad, a little wrapped up in between.
I'm a neutral good boy.
Oh, okay. Neutral goodies.
Lawful good.
So a couple things to recommend before we roll out of here, and just that's that if you do wish to play and you don't have people to play with or something like that, you can play online on Roll20. That's a website. Also, there's a tabletop simulator on Steam. And if you want to just watch some online to get a taste, I love Acquisitions Incorporated, which is the Penny Arcade guys. The DM is a dude from Wizards of the Coast, and they play with Patrick Rothfuss, which is one of my favorite fantasy authors, and they have a bunch of videos online. It's fucking way cool. There's also Geek and Sundry, which is crazy. On Twitch, I think they do it on Thursday nights. They play this game at D&D. It's a bunch of like video game and TV voice actors and stuff getting together to play, and they have, it's like 20,000 people watching them like it's crazy, and like it's just a group of people playing D&D, just sitting there at a table playing D&D together. It's fucking bonkers.
One of my favorite podcasts is The Adventure Zone, which is the McElroy brothers playing a very highly adaptive D&D campaign with their dad.
Awesome.
And it's very listenable and funny. And we got to get a game going, man.
I so want to get a game going, and Lexi, my girlfriend, also wants to get a game going. So because we just want to get into it, man. Like fully commit.
My current character is a half-orc cleric named Crunch Featherheart, who was mercilessly bullied in magic school for being half-orc, even though his very kindly human parents adopted him and told him that he was still a normal special boy.
So it's a wharf?
He's a dwarf. He's like a nerd dwarf.
Lawful good?
He's lawful good. I'd say he's trying to do he's doing it for himself though.
So chaotic good.
He wants to show those assholes they were wrong for calling him greeny big pants.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. I want to talk about this more. I think we're going to... And also, I saw a comment on Facebook, which was hilarious, in the comment thread, which, by the way, thank you very much for that comment thread stating all the different subjects you wanted us to check out and cover in this show. I kept note of all those. One person was like, don't do just D&D. There's so many good tabletop role-playing games out there, like Call of Cthulhu, etc., and we will be covering those in the future. So, dude, whatever your name is out there, man, get a job.
I mean, that's just generally good advice.
Yeah, exactly. Just get a job. And I'm the Wizard, Holden McNeely.
And I'm the Bruiser, Jake Young. Follow me at Best Jake Young on Twitter.
Yes, and watch me on Twitch at Holdenators Ho.
For more shows like the one you just listened to, go to cavecomedyradio.com.